Good morning and welcome to the Point. This past week in Lansing, two subcommittees of the State House heard emotional testimony about an uncomfortable issue, human trafficking. Testifying was Ruth Rondon, abused at an early age and abused again, she says, by the system. She says that system is getting better, and that's where we pick up her testimony.
We have made a lot of progress fighting human trafficking, and law enforcement is being trained, and so is healthcare. And I finally did get some justice, April 24 of 2018, when the court finally acknowledged my victimization and expunged my prostitution charges. That was such a proud day for me because those charges haunted me for years. Back to 1988, when I was released from jail, I stayed with my 60-year-old mother. I was able to pay her rent money this time because I walked out of jail with a little money in my pocket from a lawsuit that I filed against a methadone clinic, when my counselor withheld my methadone from me until I submitted to his sexual demands. Once again, another authority figure who saw me as easy prey. And I got sick of it. I finally got mad. And I ended up snitching on him. I was always so afraid of that snitching label, but not this time. I passed a lie detector test, and we ended up settling out of court for only $10,000. And my lawyer got a third of that. But it was enough money to start anew. My trafficker was on his way to prison at the time, so I didn't have to hand over this money to any trafficker. And I didn't have to buy any drugs with it. And my family took me back in. So I bought me a $3,000 car. I signed up for a free computer class. I went on to get my GED. And I looked for work. And right away, I started counseling and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. I started counseling with a very kind counselor. He helped me take the blinders off. He helped me see that I am not beyond redemption, like I thought I was for so long, and like so many others thought I was. Knowing this is what helped me to forgive myself, which is what I really had to do to move forward. This is when I took step 2 of the 12-step program, which reads, "We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity." You have to remember, human trafficking wasn't even a word back then. And I couldn't admit prostitution to anybody, not even to this counselor. We focused on my drug addiction and finding a job. He convinced me that I am just as forgivable as the next person, and that there's a forgiving employer out there just waiting for me to apply. And he was right. He said, "Be honest on your application about your record, Ruth. The truth will set you free." I was hired to work at a local gas station as a cashier in 1989. And in 1992, I was hired to work for the government as a clerk, and that's where I retired from. God really made the way for me. But I did relapse after being clean for almost a year. And my mother put her own life on the line and rescued me from that drug house. From my research, I learned why I never relapsed again after that. It's because even at age 33, I finally got what I needed from my mother. She proved to me that I am worth fighting for. My mother died in 2013, right after I started this research. She ended up being my hero, and I ended up being hers in her old age.
State Representative Mary Whiteford is the chairman of the Subcommittee for Health and Human Services. She held the hearing and afterwards talked to us about what she hopes the state can do to help combat the problem. Representative, you and I have talked about this issue before, but never in such detail. Talk to me a little bit about the problem of human trafficking in the state of Michigan from your perspective as somebody who's been looking into this for 5 years, somebody who has talked to people who have had the real life hellish experience of living it. and talking to the folks on the task force that are trying to do something about it. I mean, that's a big bundle of information that you've been dealing with.
It is, but we have 13,500 foster children in the state of Michigan. And that's one of the most recent things that I've learned about. Every single foster child has been traumatized in some way. Many of those children, when they age out of foster care and adoption at 18, they end up getting kicked right out of the system and couch surfing and not having places to go. So as I was doing a lot of work on foster children and then finding out the trauma that they endured, I realized that they are more likely to be exploited. Gay, lesbian children, they're more likely to be exploited because they haven't been accepted by family, peers, however that happened. But it's really the children who are abandoned, kind of our throwaway children, you may say, the ones who feel like they're not wanted, where the system has set up against them. They don't have caring parents or a grandma and grandpa. It's these children who don't have those solid support systems who are much more likely to be taken advantage of and exploited. And so that is something that I've learned over the past year predominantly, is there is such a connection to those children who don't have strong support systems, the children who have had trauma, the ACEs, that is becoming more and more of a reality in our conversations when it comes to mental illness, addressing those ACEs. And those are the children who are much more likely to be exploited.
So let's put a little finer point on this. Let's talk about the survey, the ACEs.
Okay.
Let's talk about what that is, because what you're talking about is what that survey shows, that childhood trauma, and that can come in a lot of different forms, that trauma makes children more vulnerable for those predators who would engage in trafficking. And this survey has become, in a relatively short period of time, a new tool.
It is.
So let's talk about ACEs.
Yeah, so ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. When you've got a child who doesn't have a good support system, who's just developing, you've got that little brain just firing neurons, growing every day. And if something happens to jar that process, the brain's going to figure out a way to compensate. So does it compensate in a good way? It'll compensate in a good way if there's a good support system. It will compensate in a bad way where they internalize what's happening to them if they don't get proper support. So like our woman who came and spoke today, Ruth Rondon, about her trafficking experience, not realizing what had happened. She had had a very bad experience where she had been raped, molested, and then she was punished for that. So in her little 10-year-old brain at that time, she had this happen, she saw it as an injustice, she had something come and tell her that it wasn't, that it was her fault, and her brain rewired to adapt to that. Now me, I would see an injustice because I'm an adult, and I would be able to handle that better. But if you have a child who doesn't, that is a key example of what ACEs does. It's a trauma that jars the brain, makes it go in a different direction, and sets that kid up for vulnerability and not having that self-confidence.
So having that survey, being able to get that to people, maybe not, people who are older who go back and try to, your survivor testified, years later had to go back and try to understand what the heck happened. So that becomes a tool in identifying not only people who may be vulnerable, but it helps people who have been forced into trafficking understand how that happened.
So that tool has been such an important thing for everybody to understand. The whole thing came from a study in California where they just surveyed a whole bunch of adults and said, hey, how are you now? What kind of situations happened to you as a child, and what are the connections? So through that study, they found out that there were deep connections between different traumatic events, like on that ACEs study, and them having anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, whatever mental illness that they have as an adult. They actually directly linked to a trauma as a child. So it makes everybody start thinking, what is mental illness? And how did it happen? And there are ways to prevent the advancement to serious concerns of mental illness. Interestingly, I had a tour of the Children's Psychiatric Facility, Hawthorne Center, last year. And it's 50 beds. And I asked the doctors there, I said, how many of these children have high ACEs scores were traumatized when they were before that time, 100%. So our psych hospitals are filled with people who have been traumatized, whether it's children or adults, and it's just all connected.
When you think of that now in the connection to human trafficking, obviously it makes people more vulnerable. In the state of Michigan, do we have an idea where we are in the seriousness? I mean, one case would be too serious, but the seriousness as compared to other states, where are we in Michigan as we approach the problem?
With that hotline information, we know that we are the second worst state in the country. Almost 400 cases were reported last year alone.
And this is a national hotline.
National hotline that feeds right back to Michigan.
And you make the point without finishing the sentence, reported, how many weren't reported?
Exactly. How many people don't realize what's going on with them?
So there is a commission that is in place, your committee, a joint committee. You had two committees that are looking into this. There were a bunch of recommendations that came out of this group that's been looking at some of the problems, and it sounds like it's just the tip of the iceberg. How successful, I mean, obviously you have to vet all of those things. There were a lot of suggestions, including changing the definition of prostitution. But how successful do you feel like you can be in this legislature trying to adopt those ideas that are brought forth that you believe are good ones and continue this interest? Because I asked the question against this backdrop. We were in the appropriations room, and it was as filled as it would be for an appropriations hearing. That doesn't always happen.
No, it doesn't. So we got the word out, and people wanted to know what's going on, right? And so I find it incredibly comforting knowing that there was a group of professionals who got together and decided to go through and figure out, what are we missing? What do we need to do? And so we've got these recommendations. Man, I'm going to take the charge on this. Whatever I can do to help people like Ruth and children and people who have been exploited in that way, to go after the Johns, go after the buyers. We haven't had an opportunity to be able to do that in the past, because if you remove the people willing to pay the money, you're going to remove the product that's going to be sold. And so that's crucial. I'm going to discuss this with my Speaker of the House and staff and see what we can do to make sure that we can get some major headway before summer.
And one of the things, I mean, there are a lot of different recommendations in there, but one of the things, and at first glance people might say, what? One of the things that was suggested from the speaker representing that group from the Attorney General's office was that the person providing the service, and they believe, without having exact evidence, that the overwhelming number of people who are selling this service, if you will, are being coerced into it. In other words, being trafficked, which was kind of the baseline of this hearing. That the punishment level for them would be dropped or completely exonerated. At the same time, they would like to move the penalty for the person purchasing to a felony.
To a felony.
That would be a big step.
That's a really big step. That will definitely have some people put a pause on their potential behavior if they realize it's a felony. Because right now they figure, hey, it's something I can buy and it's completely okay. Obviously, because it's such a bad situation right now across the country. And you hear about it with Super Bowl, you hear about the big golf outings, you hear it at Firekeepers Casino, you hear about it all over. The Detroit casinos, they get training as well on detecting human trafficking. So that would make a really big difference if we start penalizing buyers and giving them felonies if they're going to have that behavior.
And finally, the one other recommendation, there were many, many others, we can't go through all of them, but one other recommendation was to expand the responsibility of licensed professionals, right down to cosmetologists perhaps, to try to recognize and report the signs of human trafficking. That will make sense to some people, and some people will say, wait a minute, we don't have the expertise to do that. So some of these things are going to take some convincing, I'm guessing.
Well, I remember when they had that vote to expand the education requirement to healthcare professionals, because I'm a registered nurse, so I took that training. There was a lot of pushback. You know, the state's mandating something. Should the state be mandating things like that? But the person from the Attorney General's office was very clear. There has been a major uptick of detections from professionals, healthcare professionals, and let's expand it. And it's a simple online course that you can take just to raise awareness, to learn some more about what to look for and what you do once you get that information. And by the way, so this national number, and anybody in Michigan can call it if they are concerned that somebody's being trafficked, is 888-3737-888. So that's the national hotline. It's a great resource for people in Michigan, and every single case goes back to the Attorney General's office for further investigation.
That proposed legislation could end up on the House agenda sometime later this year. When we come back, another candidate running for Congress in the 3rd District. We'll hear from him next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Over the past 4 weeks, we've introduced you to at least 8 candidates for Congress in the 3rd District. This morning, another Republican hopeful talks about why he's running. Talk to me about your background, where you've been and what you have done leading you to the point to run for Congress.
I'm an Afghan war veteran, and I was village president up in Sand Lake for a few years. I also have been a founding member of the West Michigan Veterans Ranch, which focuses on veterans services and suicide prevention. I've been involved in politics over the years on multitudes of races. What led me to actually run is I believe that the district needs a representative that actually listens to it 100% of the time. Because you can have people who are Democrats or Republicans come to your office, and constituent relations, whether you disagree or agree on somebody's politics, your job as a congressman is to take care of those people. So I have a background of service. I was raised on a farm on the north side of Rockford. So it kind of comes from a very, very overall background that encompasses the entire district. I've also ran a small business. I sold it a couple of years ago, and I actually do sales now in order to actually pay the bills, but it's a fun job.
When you talk about running for Congress, and as you say, you've been in the arena and you've been around politics, it's a full-time undertaking as you get closer and closer to it. Why do you think this is the time? Obviously, there's opportunity with Congressman Amash no longer running as a Republican, but it's also a big field. So how do you approach a race like this when you've got a whole lot of other people out there too?
Well, we filed before all the other candidates, before the Trump tweet. We didn't file for the opportunity. We filed because the district did not have proper representation. Everybody else that's running filed for the opportunity, as they would actually like to say. So if you want another opportunist politician, all of my opponents are right there for you. When
you undertake this kind of a race, you've got to have a real motivating factor. And you talked about you want to listen and you want people to feel like they have representation. But what do you think needs to be done for this district? And as I pointed out on each of these interviews, this is a pretty diverse district.
This district is diverse. It actually encompasses a lot of it. There's one thing that I can tell you that actually is really an odd issue for it, but when you start looking at like a lot of the social issues out there, and I've never usually been the social issues candidate, when you got transgenders going into my daughter's bathrooms and things of that nature, that's something that needs to be addressed throughout the entire district. We shouldn't have that in public schools or in the public arena or the government covering that whatsoever. The other part is we need to continue to have fair trade agreements with countries like China and everything else, because we have a lot of blue collars here. And we need to reduce regulations so that businesses can thrive as well. So those are the 3 things that I think will really address this district the most and actually encompass it.
Well, when you talk about trade in China particularly, the president has already started to implement some changes to the tariffs. Are those the kind of changes that you're talking about?
Yeah, you have to have fair trade. I think that when we entered into NAFTA and a lot of these other treaties, we had the blue-collar jobs just disappear. What's starting to happen is blue-collar and middle America is starting to come back. When they talk about economic disparity, if the rich are getting richer, the middle class also gets richer as well. So everybody moves up together. But what socialism wants to do is make the rich poorer so everybody else gets poorer as well. So it is at a point where we really need to decide what type of trade policies are we going to have. Are we going to have ones that bring everybody up? Or are we going to have ones that bring everybody down?
The budget in Washington is always, well, for the past decade plus, has been a mess. Maybe before that. It doesn't go through regular order, and we end up with ever-growing deficits. At some point, That price has to be paid. We're already paying the interest on the debt. As a member of Congress, would that be a concern for you? That is, the spending of the federal government?
Yeah, I'm actually, I believe, the only candidate bringing up a balanced budget amendment constantly. I think that we have to pass a balanced budget amendment. I think we need to actually enforce it. And what we should do is go to zero-based budgeting. So that way it's line by line by line of what we're actually spending and what we're actually doing.
Is there a specific goal? I mean, you've talked about your reasoning for running. You've talked about the representation. But is there that one big item that if you were successful in the primary and in the general, that would be an issue one for you when you got to Washington?
Heartbeat legislation.
Well, explain.
Heartbeat legislation, when we passed Roe versus Wade, they talked about that Congress needed to make legislation to define when life began. Congress has never taken up that legislation and actually passed it. What we should be doing with it is passing legislation that defines where life actually begins. That would be the number one priority, followed up by border walls and actually protecting my daughter's bathroom.
How do you approach a polarized Congress? 435 members, and the divisions are strong, they are deep, and they are well drawn. Not with every member, but with many members, and much more so than I've ever seen before. So again, if you were successful, how do you approach building consensus in an area where people are deeply divided?
We need to start actually winning the actual public opinion. What we have to do is, much like what our campaign has been doing, we've been using social media. We have the largest social media footprint out of all the campaigns combined with very minimal money. We're outperforming people spending thousands of dollars. In Congress, every single time I drop a bill, I plan on actually using social media and doing live streams and posting what we're doing and communicating that way, and actually using the internet and using the modern technology so that the public can see what I'm doing constantly. That will help build a consensus from the ground up and an actual grassroots campaign nationwide for us to accomplish these types of bills.
2 years ago, in the midterm elections, Republicans did not fare well in Congress. Do you think that your prospects for election are better with the president on the ballot in this coming election cycle, or is it still going to be a tough slog for Republicans?
I think it's going to be a landslide for Republicans. What we have to do as Republicans is start identifying who we are and have bold colors. The problem with the Republican Party continues to have is they come in there and talk about these bland ideas. They don't have any bold colors. They have these pastels, and that's what Reagan talked about a lot. Every single time a Republican acts like a Republican, they win by large numbers. Every single time a Republican acts like a Democrat, they lose.
When you go to a door and knock on it and ask somebody for a vote, you get about 30 seconds to make your case, and that's how we'll end this interview. Give us your 30-second pitch.
Hi, I'm Tom Norton. I'm running for Congress in the 3rd District. I'm running because I believe that you need representation that is actually going to take care of you in Washington. Would you like to have a congressman that you can actually pick up the phone and call and the staff is going to take care of you?
The 3rd Congressional District is made up of Calhoun, Berry, Ionia, and Kent counties and is currently represented by Justin Amash, the one-time Republican, now independent. We don't know how many of the candidates that we've introduced you to will actually make it on the ballot, but we do expect a spirited primary for both the Republicans and Democrats. As for Congressman Amash, he says he will run again as an independent. We'll be back with a final thought next. To the point. This past week, we saw a lot of international headlines about tensions between the U.S. and Iran, even as the impeachment process inched forward. It's a sure sign that 2020, with a big presidential election year, is going to be one for the record books. And we'll keep track of it all every Sunday morning right here, To the Point.